The end of the 2022 season came with a shock move from McLaren Formula One.
2022 will be my last year with McLaren.
Their most expensive driver investment in years, most recent race winner, and one of the most loved drivers on the Formula One grid in Daniel Ricciardo, was dropped from the team unceremoniously with a year still remaining on his contract. As with all things in Formula One, this was no real secret. His lack of performance at McLaren had frustrated the team and left him under huge pressure for months. After his departure was confirmed, team CEO Zak Brown even said, "It was no secret that we hoped we could have achieved more together. But seeing him stand on the top step of the podium as a McLaren driver was a highlight. We wish him well for the future." And it's that future that is surrounded in so many questions yet to be answered. The 33-year-old Australian clearly wants to remain in and around Formula One, saying, "I've never been more motivated to compete and be part of a sport that I love so much and look forward to what comes next." But I think the 2022 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix will be the final time that we see Daniel Ricciardo on the Formula One grid, and here's why. First off, I want to say that I completely understand why he has faith in his ability. The Australian has been in Formula One for 11 years, 231 race starts, 32 podium appearances, 8 race wins. He has achieved an incredible amount in the sport and deserves to be talked about amongst the best of his generation. Like, you don't stick around in Formula One for that long unless you deserve it. But these last 2 seasons at McLaren have dropped his stock to all-time lows from the perspective of fans, drivers, and teams up and down the grid. But Daniel Ricciardo still has the mentality of a driver who wants to be right at the top end of that Formula One pyramid. When talking about what he had planned for 2023, he said it's now just trying to set up for 2024. I think that there could be some better opportunities then, so that's really what this all confirms, and now where the sights are set. And it's the 2 words there, better opportunities, that really caught my eye, which means that teams in and around the midfield must have been looking at Ricciardo, but Daniel must have turned those teams down, which has kind of been confirmed by Haas's team boss Gunther Steiner, who said he reached out to Ricciardo in the beginning, before the McLaren thing happened, to see what he was doing next year, but then we didn't go anywhere with it, even saying that Daniel Ricciardo never spoke to him. So the offers were on the table from those teams towards the lower echelons of Formula One. If Haas reached out, I would only imagine that Williams, Aston Martin, even AlphaTauri were all in talks with him at one time or another, but they all sit below McLaren in that pecking order. And the fact that he'd rather take a year off in 2023 and try and get a top seat in 2024 than struggle in a midfield car shows a real change in Ricciardo's personality post his time at McLaren. Roll back the clocks to 2018, Daniel Ricciardo was leaving a top team in Red Bull, a team that had given him an opportunity at race wins, and even seasons prior had put him 3rd in the championship, behind the 2 Mercedes cars, which were, unfortunately for him, just untouchable at that time. But Ricciardo left all of this to move to Renault because he had belief in himself that he could take a midfield team with high aspirations and drag them to the level of Red Bull and possibly beyond. He had that belief in his ability that he could take any team and make them race winners. Cut back to now, and he's turning down offers from teams left, right, and centre, and only wants a seat in an already established top team, which to me just shows how things turned out at McLaren has taken a toll on him mentally. I just personally feel that his expectations for where he wants to drive is way too high after the past couple of years that he's had in Formula One, especially because he no longer comes with that guaranteed team #1 tag. Outside of the obvious in wins and trophies and championships, there is one metric that all Formula One drivers are ranked against: the teammate test. It is the closest we get to seeing the drivers in essentially equal cars, and before worrying about anyone else on the Formula One grid, you have to beat your teammate. Daniel Ricciardo has almost always passed this test. He displaced 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel at Red Bull in 2014, kept pace with now 2-time world champion Max Verstappen, and also smashed the likes of Nico Hülkenberg and Esteban Ocon at Renault. Ricciardo was a #1 driver through and through, and he was going to be a marquee name at whichever team he ended up at between 2015 and 2021. He was, I think, intended to be the #1 at McLaren, whilst Lando Norris was still finding his feet in the sport. And on signing with the team, Zak Brown was even quoted saying, "Signing Daniel is another step forward in our long-term plan and will bring an exciting new dimension to the team." Whilst team principal Andreas Seidel added, "Daniel is a proven race winner and his experience, commitment and energy will be a valuable addition to McLaren and our mission to return to the front of the field." But I think now, especially after the 2022 season and being obliterated by Lando Norris, the gap between the two is just vast. Over the entire 22 races this year, As well as there being other younger drivers coming to fruition, George Russell becoming a race winner, Charles Leclerc stamping his authority as Ferrari #1, I don't think a top team would look at Ricciardo as an option to come in as a clear #1 anymore. Which poses another even bigger problem for Daniel, in that if he wants to return to Formula 1 in a big team, but not as the team's #1, he won't have sole backing of the team when it comes to the development direction of that car. What the past 2 seasons have told us about Danny Ric is that he needs a car that suits him. He doesn't have that adaptability of those drivers that can just drive whatever is put in front of them and make it look quick. Look at this McLaren car. Norris and former teammate Carlos Sainz also found this car tricky to drive, but ultimately adapted well. Daniel Ricciardo has had 44 races in Papaya, but has been frustrated by attempting to implement a counterintuitive driving style that is required by this difficult McLaren car. You would expect a driver of Ricciardo's caliber to get on top of a new car after that many races, but he still seems perplexed. Ricciardo's problem is that he likes to carry speed into the corner by actually braking a little bit earlier and rolling the speed into the apex, not attacking the braking as much as this car requires. Something that Dan and the team knew about and were trying to work on. Take this quote from Andrea Stella, McLaren's executive director of racing. Daniel knows what to do in terms of working on the simulator, in terms of coaching the driver, but the progress that we see race after race is not necessarily a switch. This inability to adapt has been highlighted massively on tracks with technical, slow-speed corners, where getting the braking wrong and over-rotating through the corners has cost him so much time in comparison to others. And this has continued over both of his years at McLaren, because whilst the 2022 regulations may have been a huge technical overhaul in Formula 1, they didn't eradicate many of the characteristics of the McLaren car that made it so tricky to drive. When asked, Daniel Ricciardo even said the 2022 regulations make the car feel different, but the DNA of the car is still very similar, even going as far as saying the car that I have now is completely not what I want for my driving style and is very unsuited for me. Which has led to giant gaps between Norris and Ricciardo in the standings, and there have been flashes of it working, but those flashes have been at very specific tracks rather than him actually building momentum in that car with multiple good results on the bounce. Whilst on the topic of adapting though, because we've only seen him in a McLaren car that already didn't suit him at all, we actually have no idea if he can adapt to the new regulations. These 2022 cars are very different to the cars that we've seen him thrive in back in 2020 and previous. Obviously, I'm not saying that he couldn't drive these cars. I'm a true believer that form is temporary, class is permanent, and Danny Ric oozes class when he clicks with a car. Luckily, this will be slightly less of a question in a year's time. Thanks to his testing role at Red Bull for the 2023 season, we will see what kind of pace he has in a completely different style of 2022/2023 Formula 1 car, and maybe he gets himself in as a Perez replacement, but I personally doubt it. All those reasons combined lead to me believing that Daniel Ricciardo may have had his last race in Formula 1. It's sad to say, as Ricciardo came into the sport just as I was getting into Formula 1 back in 2011, he's been a mainstay on the grid and has brought so many wonderful moments both on and off track. Obviously, as a McLaren fan, I will always be so grateful for that win in Monza, getting the McLaren car to the top step of a podium for the first time since 2012 when Hamilton and Button were together. Outside of that, he is an incredible character to have in the sport. His smile is just infectious, and I hope that we still get to see him around the paddock a lot next year and in the future, but I think his on-track days might be over. Of course, that's just my take, and I would love to be proven wrong, and actually, I'd love to know what you think in the comments down below. Will we see Daniel Ricciardo back on the Formula 1 grid in the future? Who takes that gamble on Daniel Ricciardo? Whilst you're down there, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I'll see you next time.